this on? Good evening, and thanks to all of you for joining us this evening for the launch of Lisa Ray's first book. Having read the book, I am certain that there'll be several more, and perhaps we'll all be gathering here every couple of years if AD would have us. When we received the book in office a couple of months ago, an early copy, a colleague of mine started reading it and came up to me and said, has she really written this? It's really good. I was instantly irritated, the stereotypes we have about women, about beautiful women, about what women can achieve. And I stayed irritated with this colleague for a while. Also because having met Lisa a couple of times over the last few years, I know how dedicatedly she was working on this book. I know she was at it since 2010. When I visited her flat in Bandra, she had this big fat manuscript on a desk in her bedroom, and it's all she wanted to talk about. So I knew she was perfectly capable of writing a good book. But then I read the book, and unfortunately, I had the same doubt as my colleague. Has she really written this? Because it's more than a good book. It's the kind of book that stirs you. It's the kind of memoir that does the heavy lifting for the reader to excavate their own synchronous emotions that Lisa writes about in the book, from love, ambition, hope, loss, insecurity, family, failure, all of it. Which is not to say it's all about emotion. There's a lot of masala in there for those who are looking for it. Right at the beginning, we have a young Lisa thwacking the son of an industrialist across his forehead with a shoe because he tried to grope her in his shoe closet. We have Lisa's formidable mother in a wheelchair accosting burglars who've entered their home, saying, "You want to kill me? What's the worst you can do? Kill me right now." The burglar is sent running away. We have the underworld, we have a Mr. X, we have flirting with Sean Penn, which was not what I knew about earlier at a Vanity Fair party. So, and there's this fabulous part that I call Lisa's Jab We Met moment with a happy ending. And I think before we even start the questions, I'd love for you to read that part just to set the tone of you as a 16-year-old backpacker in Croatia landing up at this doorstep.
Yes, thank you so much. And I also quickly wanted to say that having UnEdited here today, conducting this is a great honor. We're both of Bengali origin. And, only if you are Bengali will you understand what I mean when we say that, in the blood, in our genes is contained this kind of a literary collage, and even if you don't manifest it in your life, but I think somewhere we all aspire to have something to do with words. It's something that's passed on to us, and it's considered perhaps the highest calling. And so, I'm really greatly honored to have her here today and to be a champion of the book for a lot of the reasons also that she's mentioned, because I quickly wanted to say, of course, there are certain perceptions of someone who has inhabited the business that I have inhabited for many years when I started at 16. And your image sort of calcifies at a certain point of time when you've been doing this as long as you have. Where the truth of the matter is, I've always been a misfit. I've always had this very strange, unique ability to sort of be, inhabit a situation, and then a certain part of me is watching, to be an observer. And then I've always also had a notepad in my back pocket. And today, of course, it's maybe notes in my iPhone, but I've always taken notes. I've always been an observer of both my life and the life around me. So I've just been looking for an opening to be able to share my insights, my misadventures, and the many sort of triumphs and dark periods that I've been through. So UnEdited, I'm going to start with, where do you suggest I start? That this was 1991 and Yugoslavia. Where had we said?
I finally reached my destination in Croatia.
Yes.
Can I give you the part I've marked, if that's okay?
Okay.
And
I'm just going to
read
do
as
that.
much as you'd like to, and we can stop off. And get
I've got it. I've got
Yeah.
it right here. So yeah, so I was always rather rebellious, trying to challenge the conventions and the norms. So I decided that I was going to take off. My parents packed me off to Switzerland with sort of a guardian, and I decided that Switzerland felt a lot like Canada, which was boring and very sterile. So I decided spontaneously to buy a ticket to Croatia, to Yugoslavia, what was Yugoslavia at the time, to chase down this very cute boy that I knew back in Toronto.
Who had given you an open invitation, a vague kind of
A
invitation.
very vague invitation, you know, thinking that nobody's actually going to follow up on this vague invitation. I finally reached my destination in Croatia, a village close to Split, the largest coastal town in the country. It was early morning, the sun just breaking. When you fancy yourself a traveler and not a tourist, you develop a taste for disorienting arrivals. It's always early morning or late at night when you stumble into a new place and you are alone except for some solitary cab driver or another misfit like yourself. This very large feeling hits me on every arrival of this nature. I am an insignificant dot, a minuscule part of creation. I remember having one of those moments looking around that empty Croatian village. It was unkempt, like a wild girl gone to seed, bristly grass poking out from the gravel everywhere. Outside the whistle stop was the one taxi and a dusty road. The driver was dozing. I woke him and showed him my map. When I presented myself at Goran's door at 6 a.m., suitcase at my feet, the palest scale was behind me, turning me into a silhouette. Now that I was here, I had no idea what reception I would get. Goran was quite naturally surprised and sleepy, patting his hands over his hair self-consciously. But I was immediately welcome to stay. Yawning young faces emerged from inner rooms to gawk at me over Goran's shoulder. The house was full. There were cousins and kids with indecipherable ties. She's my mother's aunt's second cousin's daughter, spilling out of everywhere, but not a single adult. I was quickly absorbed into that youthful chaos, and under the gaze of so many eyes, Goran and I embarked on a whirlwind romance. After all, there's no spare room, so you're just going to have to sleep with me. He was an incredibly sexy guy, brooding with thick, dark, floppy hair. Almost every man I've been with since has possessed a variation on this look.
This is the cue for everyone to look at Jason right now, sitting in the front row.
But at the same time, I had just recently discovered boys in earnest. Goran's family's home was a Spartan but comfortable 3-story house constructed of a simple whitewashed cement set on the side of a hill. Soon, word spread and most of the neighbors came by curious about this Canadian girl who had just shown up. Goran and I were trailed when we linked fingers and walked to the village center for coffee and to call my parents. The town seemed relatively prosperous. The small iron tables in the cafes were full, though no one seemed preoccupied with work. It was functioning on a typical Eastern European remittance economy where family members who had gone abroad sent money back to relatives who stayed behind. You could see the homes built from that money, slightly newer, slightly fresher with television antennas, but still cinder block and whitewashed with a red roof. We would swim in the local swimming hole, a scenic bend in the river where a large tree provided an overhanging branch from which the more adventurous boys would launch themselves into the water. It was a fine way for them to preen and show off. We'd walk for miles through cornfields, sometimes for no reasons, sometimes to visit an impressive hog. Goran's female cousin showed me how they made dolls out of corn stalks. At night, Goran and I slept on a mattress in the loft, whispering in the light of a battery-powered lantern. I remember lying very still next to Goran, holding in my happiness, while the moon spilled drapes of light from a window set high under the roof.
Thanks. So hopefully that gives you a little taste of the book in terms of, the storytelling and the anecdotal writing, which is, I think, restricted to the first half, and then we move on to more of an internal exploration. So Lisa, I want to start with talking about structure and style, because you've said in recent interviews that the way the story was told was as important to you as the story itself. And you really fought for that. You withdrew a really lucrative publishing deal, fought with your agent. A lot of things went down there. So what was your starting point in terms of storytelling? Who are the memoirists that you've really admired? Where did you get the seed of how you were going to tell the story?
That's a great question. So a lot of the memoirists that I have admired or that I've read recently, the one that pops to mind recently is something called Educated by Tara Westover. And I really endorse this book and recommend it to absolutely everyone. But my taste is that, exactly as UnEdited said, it's not just a story, it's also how the story is told. The quality of writing, there should be a little bit of enigma in the story, that the places where your own imagination can perhaps fill in the gaps, where you can meet the experience of the author. So not every single thing should be spelled out. And I really obviously respond to writing. What I find I connect with the most is in a great specificity and getting very specific in describing taste, smell, the way that the light falls on someone's glasses. I actually find myself there, transported, but in that, I also I identify my own personal experiences. And that's really, really important for me, is to, in the very specific, we find the universal. And you find yourself, and you find your own experiences. And so I wanted to also emphasize that, again, I imagine that there will be perceptions, obviously, about my memoir, and amongst them, which would be very legitimate, is that it's a cancer memoir, that it all has to do with my battling this disease, which I've been very public about. And in a sense, it's not. I do cover my cancer experiences, but that comes much later. Although, having said that, cancer was the launching pad for writing this memoir, because initially that's why I was approached to write this. And I was approached off of a blog that I had written called The Yellow Diaries, in which I chronicled my cancer experiences literally week by week by week. And I was using writing, which is something I've always turned to my entire life, to try to process and decode a very emotional, very challenging period that I was going through. So off of that, I was offered the opportunity to write my memoir. When I sat down and thought about it, I realized that I couldn't write about my disease in isolation from the rest of my life, because everything is connected with what came before, and it's also connected with a part of my Buddhist philosophy, which is something that has also deeply influenced my personal worldview and my healing. So if my disease does not happen in isolation from the rest of my life, how far back do I have to go? And I realized that I had to start from the beginning, and the beginning was actually my parents' story. So even though I actually start the memoir with describing myself, preparing myself to actually share my diagnosis of cancer publicly on the red carpet at the Toronto International Film Festival, after that I segue into my childhood, but more importantly into my parents. And this was a revelation for me in writing the book. If I had to pick a single revelation, something that I didn't anticipate, it was my parents, So as I said, I kind of fancy myself a bohemian, a rebel, someone who challenges the norm. Where did that come from? And I realized that it was passed on in what I describe my kaleidoscopic genes. My father's a Bengali, my mother's Polish, and between the two of them, they created this strange creature.
You go beyond your parents to your grandparents
And
as well.
also to my grandparents.
So
Thank
I
you
think,
for reminding me.
A
Yes.
lot of the book, I mean, you've spent a lot of time in setup, right? Starting from your Bengali grandfather who was a judge, him sitting in his planter's chair in this palatial Calcutta home reading Jugantor, which is a specific type of intellectual, read that. And to your Polish grandmother who divided the world into elegant and not elegant.
Non-elegant, yes.
So, which is what I wanted to kind of ask you next about how important context was to you, but you've kind of already answered that. In a way, you know, your rebellious spirit and your kind of love for travel and adventure was something that your parents sowed in you. I mean, they picked up and just moved to Bombay and lived in ISKCON, which is a wild story in itself when you were 16. And your mother was sneaking in chicken soup into the all-vegetarian ISKCON living quarters.
No.
So yeah, so I think a little bit of your naughty streak is possibly from them.
And it's interesting because we normally don't frame our parents and our lineage in those terms, particularly when we're younger, you know. We see our parents through a very different framework, you know. They are more, perhaps sometimes, they're the rule makers, you know. They provide a safe container for us, but they also provide borders and rules that you're not supposed to traverse. And you know, when I actually started speaking to my father, I said, tell me a little bit more, because he was always a little bit shy about sharing the entire breadth of my parents' romance, because it was not easy in those days for a Pole and a Bengali Brahmin to get together. Like, that was quite a spicy romance, but they would always get kind of giggle behind their hands whenever they confronted them and questioned them about it. So I kind of pinned him down and got him to tell me about that, but more importantly, about how my father was essentially excommunicated from his family. It was a very liberal family, a very educated family, but still excommunicated from his family for not marrying the woman of his family's choice. And how my parents had to then make a go of it independently. And the choices that they made, I think in any context, but even more so for the period in which they were living, you know, the 50s and the 60s, was extremely rebellious, extremely brave, extremely visionary, and, you know, very ahead of their times. But I did not see it that way. And today I can see that this rebellious streak, basically, I had no choice in the matter but to become a rebel and to basically challenge a lot of things. It was basically embedded in my marrow. From my blood, it was embedded in my marrow. And as I said, the choices that both my parents made and that I ended up making would both, I guess, they were provided a lot of blessings and a lot of trauma, both, you know. But, you know, that is the the inherent in our lives, is we do have to take responsibility for our choices. And I do also want to say, Anandita, that you had actually brought this up, that there's a lot of joy also, even though I write very frankly about a lot of the obstacles and trauma and difficulties. I've also studied a certain amount of, immersed myself in asking questions, not necessarily always finding the answers, but asking the questions, immersing myself in Buddhism, immersing myself in a lot of Osho's teachings, in a lot of, you know, going on a spiritual road trip, which is kind of wild, in a golden car, and not necessarily finding the answers, but in being able to accept the entire package of life, both the light and the shadow, and understanding and not judging it as good or bad, but this is the great glory of life.
Well, there's definitely a lot of humor in the writing. I mean, you speak about how the journey of your cancer treatment started off with learning how to floss your teeth. I mean, you know, one would expect something far more grave and serious from a person who's been on a spiritual road trip. I thought maybe you'll go on this final pilgrimage before starting the treatment, but you learned how to floss because that's apparently important.
Yes, because I had very bad dental hygiene before that.
So there is a lot of humor interspersed, and I wonder how all your spiritual lessons from, you know, from Buddhism to Osho to your trips to Shirdi, kind of added to that. But before we get to the spiritual part, which is a whole big chunky part, I would say that's the heart of the book in itself, I want to talk about the idea of leaving. That seems to be a running trope through the book. Lisa Ray leaving. Leaving Toronto for Mumbai, leaving Mumbai for London, leaving Maureen Vadia's luxurious abode to strike it out on your own, leaving London to come back, you know, setting up in Milan, Paris, renting a flat in New York. So you seem to be leaving even lucrative projects, men's, all of that. So when did you kind of come to terms with this idea of leaving? When did it stop being a failure and become a strength? The idea that you could just pick up and go.
That's a great question. I should preface it with saying, baby, I'm not going to leave you. And just in case we take this theme to its natural conclusion, I think I start out at one point by saying I believe I was born a nomad. And that also, I think, is a little bit due to also my parents and what they passed on to me. And leaving, this idea of departures and at the same time arrivals, has been a very strong theme in my life that I think I'm still trying to understand. I think when I was younger, leaving and moving was more about moving away from, leaving something behind, trying to change my circumstances by leaving my environment. Or, you know, just kind of obeying this very restless kind of call in my blood, this mania. It was like traveling in a little bit more of a mania. And also trying to, you know, it was adrenalized. It was like the next experience, the next city, the next this, the next that. Don't hold me down because maybe I was too afraid of confronting
you write
and staying
in one
with
part
myself.
about how your mind felt choked with mud when you were stagnant back in Toronto. So you have tried to really poeticize and understand and philosophize that part as well. And it didn't always work in your favor. You've written about how your friend Sujata Asumol kind of was worried. You were being labeled this errant runaway model, like should you be given campaigns because no one knows when you're going to pick up and go. So it hasn't always worked in your favor.
No, it hasn't at all. But to the second part of your question, Anandita, I do feel that today there is a certain part of me that has I have a kind of a solid faith in let's say impermanence. And impermanence is a concept that can sound very frightening and very destabilizing. But if you actually embrace impermanence, which at its core, like it or not, is the true reality of this world that we inhabit, once you kind of become more comfortable with that, in whatever way it takes you to become comfortable with that, and life has certainly thrown a lot of experiences in my way. Okay, if you didn't learn that lesson, here's another lesson to help you become comfortable with the impermanence and the constant changes in life. As I became more at ease with that, that mania in me of always having to leave has kind of smoothed out. So I still travel a lot. For instance, just 4 weeks ago, my husband and I have decided that now we've left Hong Kong and we're now based in Bombay. And just like
leaving
that.
again.
So leaving, yes. But going to something with a kind of an intention and with a very, I try to be really, really honest with myself today. It's taken a lot of practice to get there. I'm not always successful at it. So I try to call myself on stuff. What am I actually trying to escape? I'm not escaping something. I know that I am coming to something. So the mania has left. I'm a lot more comfortable with impermanence. So I try not to get too attached to any particular situation. I watch myself. Obviously, it's very difficult practice with family, with friends. But this idea of moving and being able to be fluid, I think is an asset, is a very strong asset, particularly in today's world where there's a lot of migration, where the world as we know it is changing constantly around us. And I know that a lot of people are spinning out of control because of that.
You had this Ayurvedic doctor explain that to you, saying your dosha was vata. So I guess you kind of understood it that way. There's a beautiful, Some point in the book when you understand what's going on with all this leaving, you write about how you realized you were not adrift like a leaf in a storm, but riding hidden currents of air. So you made that some kind of strength.
It's, I think, more about surrender, which again is a very scary word and implies that you're passive, but surrender means being aligned with these kind of hidden currents that are running beneath us all constantly, and that sometimes maybe we don't have to struggle so hard, we don't have to effort so hard, that we can still be ambitious, that we can still have a particular vision for our life and intention, but we can let go a little bit, and we can be carried along with those currents, and we will get to where we need to go. And that's a really interesting teaching, and I think that's just an interesting philosophy to at least contemplate, if not embrace in your life.
Lisa, you write about, and it comes up a couple of times in the book, how the birth of your success in your mind is forever linked to the accident that you faced as a family, which left your mother forever bound to a wheelchair. And you soon kind of embarked on this great spiritual quest, following, again, flying from one school to another, trying out what works for you. How have you tried to explain that to you? Because if you truly think that way, if that linkage still stays in your head, it's a pretty hard thing to live with, to think that every time you think of your success, you think of your mother's accident. So how have you kind of explained that to yourself?
That's a great question. Your questions are amazing, I have to just say. That I think may never actually go, but the potency obviously has gone away. But perhaps one benefit of actually starting my career, literally on the edge of a knife, I call it, because on one side was fame, money, reputation, accolades, and on the other side was great personal tragedy. And so they will be forever linked. But perhaps the incredible benefit of that has been that I have been able to understand from a young age that all of the aspects that we define as success, fame, money, status, actually don't solve the questions of the soul. They really, really don't. And I mean, I'm sure all of us have met people who seem to have it all, but you can still be profoundly unhappy. And the unhappiness can come from many different sources. But the point is that while it's great to have money, and I am not saying we certainly all need a certain amount of money, we all have ambition, we want validation from the world, but it does not actually heal you, it does not solve the questions of the soul. And I understood that from such a young age that it helped me to sort of move beyond that, maybe perhaps a bit quicker, because this all happened at 16, and it's not that I suddenly had this revelation, but I can't help but think that the two kind of work together to help me transcend. So I wasn't always, my ambitions became much different. My goals were not to become more and more famous, which probably explains a lot of my choices. It wasn't about
the low-key projects that you picked.
All the projects that I said no to, because I really understood that perhaps also in some way that my answers were not waiting at the end of that. And on top of that, for who I am, there was a certain aspect of me that would even be extinguished by actually conforming to mainstream standards and taking those decisions and perhaps going full hog into Bollywood at the time when I was being offered big mainstream roles.
I just want to give a quick summary because not everyone here has probably read the book already to kind of explain this, the edge of a sword that you're talking about. Is that very briefly, you must read the book. It's a 400-page book. This is a 2-minute summary of just the first 1/4 of it. Is that when Lisa was 16 and before starting university, she decided to take a gap year. Her parents became part of this adventure and they moved to Bombay, which is after this whole Croatia and Europe adventure. There's also a Mr. V, but I think we won't get into that. Let people read that bit. There's a Mr. V in London when she's 16. But anyway, parents come here and they decide, hey, it's a great idea to just stay at ISKCON And we can,
'Cause we couldn't
instead of
afford anything
renting
else,
a
we couldn't
flat,
rent.
but they weren't really into it. So her mother was sneaking in chicken soup, and Lisa was out partying almost every night. Details of the parties and the people she met, very candid, are all in the book. Then they left ISKCON and went back. And in this brief idyllic period of, again, Lisa's supposed to start university, they have a car accident, which leaves Lisa with a mild neck injury, a father almost unscathed, but her mother is then rendered, she's bound to a wheelchair. And while Lisa, who's again still 16, is kind of helping her family and helping her mother recuperate, it's a bit too much for her, which is when Maureen Vadia, who had kind of taken her under her wing in the 1 year that she was in Bombay earlier, part of her hard parting years, kind of flies down to Canada and offers to kind of chaperone her life back in India. So it's a tough decision for a 16-year-old to make. Should I really need to leave this place because I'm, just going to a hospital every day as much as I love my mother I don't know how I'm helping. But it was a big decision to make, and it must have caused a lot of heartache and agony about whether to stay or whether to come back. And I think from there on, Lisa's life was always kind of 1 foot in India, 1 foot in Toronto, and many other feet, other parts of the world. You have many feet. So it was always a kind of back and forth from here to there, which I think also kind of sets up the 2 points of your spiritual quest. It seems like a Toronto, Mumbai at 2 ends and many other things in between.
It's also been, I guess, an expression of straddling 2 worlds or multiple worlds, which, because I'm of mixed blood, us mixed breeds kind of occupy this very interesting space. And fortunately, there's more of us today. I think we should take over the world eventually. Obama in case. But I think that, you end up occupying a very interesting space because you have an insight into both of these worlds, but you never fully belong into either of them, and you develop, I think, this unique ability to be adaptable, to change according to the situation. I am personally very aligned to India. I actually, in my head, I'm Indian, and India is my country and the place I feel most connected to, but I have Polish blood, and I'm fluent in Polish. And my Polish grandmother brought me up. I learned Polish. It was my first language. So there is that aspect. And of course, when I'm traveling, people can't pin me down. They can't put me in a box. They can't label me. Who are you and where are you from exactly is a question I've gotten relentlessly in my life. And it led to a lot of identity issues.
But it excited you as well. I mean, you
It also
really drew
excites
from
me.
that in your modeling career, right? This idea of being anybody and
It
everybody.
very much excited me, but perhaps on a deeper level, that is what perhaps set me questioning to say, well, who am I really, or who am I beyond all these identities? Because one thing that I've always chafed against is living within those boxes and those labels. And I had to do it from a young age because when I was 16, I was a sex symbol. And it was completely unanticipated, completely, serendipitous. But to suddenly become this figure for an entire nation, and on top of that to look much older, that has kind of haunted me my entire life. Up until now, this book probably, where a lot of people won't understand how I've always had this ambivalent relationship with my career, how I'm an accidental actress, how I've always had 1 foot in it, 1 foot out of it, and how I believe that I've been underestimated as well, only because of the way that I look, although I don't feel that they should be at odds with each other.
But unfortunately, I think preconceived notions take a while. Since you use the word serendipity, I want to kind of just mention that little passage you have about the etymology of the word. So apart from all, the spiritual quests and the anecdotes and the shoe hitting men with shoes, etc., there's also a lot of poetry referenced. There's some of Lisa's original poetry as well, and there's a lot of referenced reading. So there's, I learned in the book, and I studied linguistics, and I learned it from your book, that the word serendipity is actually, comes from Serendib, which is a name for Sri Lanka, and it's from a short story called The Three Princes of Serendip, which was a story about how just unusual things or surprising things keeps happening to the princes. So that's the etymology of serendipity, one of the things I learned from the book. So
and one of my favorite words.
yeah,
as
and
well.
there are recipes in here as well. So there's like something for everyone as you go along. I think this is now an excellent point after we talk about worldly knowledge and travel to talk about your kind of spiritual road trip across India in with a man called Krishna, which I would call serendipity as well as your co-traveler, in a gold Hyundai. Like just
A
just
golden
drop that.
car.
Yes, just drop that in there and just tell everybody how that came to be. You traveled from Dharamshala to
Yes,
Osho
so
Ashram in
basically
Pune.
I had decided I had been on a 6-month long retreat, also serendipitous, which has been really the mistress in my life. But in Dharamshala, where I had been immersed in Tibetan Buddhism, and at the core of a lot of Buddhist teaching is this concept called emptiness, which is really nothing exists as we believe it does. And when you really meditate on it for long periods of time, it becomes like you feel yourself disappearing. So I decided that maybe I need to take a little bit of a journey around India to see what other people have to teach, because I literally felt myself disintegrating at one point. So Krishna and I decided, we went back to Delhi. We bought a golden Hyundai. I believe that I actually sold off a piece of art, a Paratosh Sen that I had. And with that, we ended up buying a golden Hyundai, and we embarked on this spiritual road trip where there was literally no map, there was no plan. I remember my auntie in Delhi, I couldn't fully explain what my intentions are. She was quite horrified, but she kept throwing in Imodium and, various other, you need, whatever, towels and, all of this. Like, it was like a survival kit for me. And I kind of looked at her because I knew I wouldn't use any of it. It was such a kind of like a free fall experience and a true kind of a experiment with truly trying to align yourself with what is. We in our life live these lives that are so circumcised by plans, by responsibilities, by the things that we should do. And a lot of the should start in our mind. And I did have an intention behind this trip, but I decided to take all the shoulds away. And we literally traveled back up to Dharamshala. We would we'd clamber up the sides of mountains to meet Rinpoches or, certain Babas in Himachal Pradesh. A lot of